Bruce, thank you. That was tremendously informative and interesting, and in some ways very concerning. I mean, in many ways, what you set out there was not a view of one America, but two Americas that exist alongside one another within the same country, a picture of a deeply polarized electorate across a huge number of issues. I'd just like to, Bruce, if I may, just start with perhaps as it is current, the debate last night. Not that I would accuse the Ideas Network followers of being low information voters, but you said that for those who may have not caught the debate, that the widely accepted result is that Harris won the debate for a number of reasons. I wonder whether or not you think that actually do these debates in the grand scheme of things, do they matter? Do voters pay attention to them? And if they do pay attention to them, do they change minds even within a divided electorate?
I think we are so deeply divided. I think if they have any impact, it's much less than it was in the past. Because I think, for example, the support for Donald Trump is largely baked in. He has bragged that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they'd still vote for me. And cynically, I kind of think that's probably the case. She, though, could have lost support if she had performed poorly. So in a way, performing well, and I think everyone believes that she performed very well, except Donald Trump, who came out and said he won. That shored up any potential erosion of herd support. Clearly, when Joe Biden kind of lost his train of thought and had a senior moment, and it said that really did affect his decision to step down. And we know in the past, for example, when John F. Kennedy first debated Richard Nixon back in 1960, it was, I think, assessed that he won the first debate because he was sitting on the stage with the sitting vice president, and he was some junior senator, so he had to kind of show that he could hold his own, and he was that you could maybe see this guy as the president of the United States. So in that case, it had an influence. There are famous moments in debates where one candidate uses a zinger against the other candidate, or one candidate kind of fumbles a question, but it probably had some effect. But I think in this case, it helped her by shoring up her support and demonstrating to people who might have been in the middle, oh, I could maybe see her as president. And so that's useful to her. For him, it's hard to say, because as much as he dissembled and lost his kind of his temper and seemed to kind of just lose it, I think a lot of Americans have said, well, it's just Trump being Trump. And they kind of psychologically dismiss it a bit, which I think is dangerous, because you want the person who's president not to be so easily rattled, which was clearly what she did.
We've got a question, if I may, coming in from John Boas, who would like to ask a question about foreign relations and their significance in this election. He says that if Republicans increasingly want to have fewer links with other countries, how do they see Trump's love affair with the villains of the world, such as Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Netanyahu?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, what was interesting in the debate last night, basically Trump used Viktor Orban to give him a character reference. That Viktor Orban says, I'm great, and it for those of us who know who Viktor Orban is, it's like, really? He's using this guy as a character reference? I think most Americans had never heard of Viktor Orban. So maybe it didn't hurt him. I'm sure it helped him. I guess there's some right-wing Republicans who like Viktor Orban. Um, but I think Trump likes foreign leaders who um, bolster his ego, who treat him as, a respected leader of the world, um, and who share his authoritarian instincts. I think, again, one thing to watch in this is like, who knows, but he's really tough on China. And he promises all these tariffs and other things, says nasty things about China. If he gets elected, let's watch and see what happens if Xi says, I'd like to invite you to Tiananmen Square. We're going to have the biggest military parade in history, and I want you to stand up there on the dais with me and review these troops, and whether Trump jumps at the chance. Because when Macron did that, Macron, a Democrat, fellow member of NATO, invited him to the military parade in Paris on Bastille Day. He came back supposedly and demanded we have the same parade in the United States. Until the military said, well, if we do that, the tanks will rip up Pennsylvania Avenue. It'll cost too much money, But he loves the show, and that I think he loves being treated the way authoritarian leaders treat him.
Indeed, I remember that that visit to Paris very well, when Trump went over and Macron put on, which was quite a spectacular parade, I must say. But I wonder, my question to you, Bruce, is how much does this matter to the American electorate? I mean, when I say this, I mean foreign policy, international relations. I mean, are they things that are in the minds of most Americans at the moment?
Well, I do think that there's a pretty strong sentiment that people do not want to be engaged in foreign conflicts. Harris last night bragged about it, kind of a narrow choice of words to say there's no American soldier in an armed conflict right now anywhere in the world. Well, there's a lot of, as the Republicans push back later and say, well, there are a lot of American soldiers in dangerous places. I mean, they just aren't declared wars. But that was clearly aimed at addressing American public concern that we don't want another Afghanistan, we don't want another Iraq. The polling data is very clear. People are willing to help Taiwan if it's attacked by China, but they like less than 10% are willing to send troops. As I did a survey about this recently and showed it to somebody in the Pentagon, and he looked up at me and said, I wish somebody had told Biden these numbers before he promised to send troops. Um, so, I think people don't want to be engaged in foreign conflicts where their sons and daughters might get killed.
Yeah.
I think that most public surveys show that the public wants to remain part of NATO, despite Donald Trump's claims that we're bearing all the burdens. They support Ukraine, although that support is waning. It took 6 months for the U.S. House of Representatives really to pass the last Ukraine aid bill. I don't even want to take a bet about how long it could take if we can pass one in the next Congress. Certainly, if Donald Trump is president, I doubt that would be the case. But it's going to be a hard slog for Harris as well. I think that people are worried about China, and it's interesting. We were very worried and antagonistic towards Japan in the 80s and early 90s. And it was all about trade.
It was, and Donald Trump himself famously was printing adverts in major newspapers, I believe, calling out Japan.
Yeah, and the fears of China are, people are worried about trade with China and the job losses that have occurred because of trade with China. but it's a broader fear because this is we were never going to go to war with Japan. And so there's a fear of conflict with China. It's interesting that Donald Trump keeps bringing up, oh, we're going to have World War III. And I don't really know how much that is resonating with people, although I did see a focus group or whatever recently where, young people kind of were expressing concern about. So really, it's obviously resonating with some people, and of course that means, pull back, don't don't antagonize the Russians or the Chinese. Um, but I think we are a large continental economy with two oceans on one on each side. It is, and I think it's very hard to get the American public to really care about foreign policy. When you do surveys at the beginning of the year, which I know Pew does and other people do, and you kind of list a bunch of challenges that may be out there and what should be done, things that got to be dealt with this year. Foreign policy is always very low in that. Um, uh, Although it's a little higher now because of the Gaza war.
Yeah.
I would say though that trade has always been at the bottom, since, at least since we got over the fear of Japan. Um, so it's all relative, um, and the reality is, before Russia invaded Ukraine, only a third of Americans could find Ukraine on a map. When Obama threatened to bomb Syria because of their use of chemical weapons and eventually decided not to. But a survey was done at that time. Only 20% of Americans could find Syria on a map. So, but they didn't want Obama to do anything, which I interpreted at the time as, we don't know where Syria is. We don't care, but we don't want to get involved in another war. And I think that's the motivating factor.
Quick question for you. I'd like to just ask you about Gaza. I think the slide you pulled up earlier was quite interesting because it showed a clear trend actually, and I was quite surprised by that result. I mean, the impression one might have here is that support for Israel is very, very solid in the United States. Now, the question I had was, in the UK election in July, a number of MPs were elected, independent MPs, specifically on the sole issue of Gaza, particularly voters on the left turning out for them because they were dissatisfied with the Labour Party's position. Do you think that Gaza will have an effect in the key swing states with Democratic voting in particular on turnout, or is this not something we can expect to be a factor?
Well, I mean, no, it's a great question, and I think there are people who, in the Democratic Party in particular, worry about that, and the Republican Party tries to stir it up in the Arab American community. I mean, the short answer is we don't know. It's really probably the biggest issue. Well, the issue is the biggest in Michigan, where there is a large Arab American community. Um, you had demonstrations on campuses in the spring. My guess is you'll get some more demonstrations in the fall. And so an ancillary issue is, if you get a lot of demonstrations, do the Republicans, irrespective of the fact that they're about Israel and Gaza, say, look, there's chaos in the streets and you should vote for Republicans and we'll get rid of this? I mean, so it could play into the election in kind of in that way, it almost as um, an angle shot in pool or snooker, right? Where you basically bounce it off the wall to get the effect. In Michigan, particularly, there are people who say, we're going to organize and stay home out of protest. It'll be interesting to see how the Democrats handle that. I mean, at some level, you want to say to the Arab Americans who are dissatisfied with how Biden has handled this, um, do you really want Donald Trump to be president, who is buddy buddy with Netanyahu and appears to have no sympathy for the Palestinians at all? Now that's rational, and there their anger at the Biden administration is emotional, and people tend to vote on emotion. So we'll see. Now, one, I think, interesting indicator was one assumed, expected major demonstrations at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, and basically it didn't happen. Small demonstrations didn't get out of control, which may be a sign that the press, and I used to be a member of the press, so I'll say we in the press, overestimated the potency of this issue. But it remains to be seen. I do know that folks on the left remain bitterly frustrated with Biden on this. And I even looked back to see in when George H.W. Bush was president in 1990, I think it was, or 1991, he wanted to get the Israelis to come to some kind of peace conference in Spain. And the Israelis didn't want to come. But at the time, we still gave a significant amount of economic aid to Israel. And literally, James Baker, the Secretary of State, said, well, that housing loan we were going to give you, it's really tied up in the bureaucracy. I don't know when it can ever come out. And the Israelis came to the meeting. We don't give much, if any, economic aid to Israel anymore. So if you were trying to impose direct pressure on Israel, you'd have to start cutting off military aid. And that clearly has been much more difficult decision to make by the Biden administration. And you could argue that understandably, or maybe that he should do it. People have different views. But Harris, I'd say, has been more critical of Israel. I think the Biden administration is increasingly frustrated with Israel. But that hasn't led to a rupture.
Bruce, we have another question from our audience, and I have to say this is something that I was very interested to ask you about, and it's probably the question that is on the minds of a lot of Americans at this point in time, is Taylor Swift. Do you think her endorsement with close to 3 million followers, and this is a question from Trisha DeBorschgrave, I should add, do you think her endorsement with close to 3 million followers will have a significant positive impact for Harris? Will young voters get out and vote in ways they haven't perhaps before? And could you give us a bit of an analysis on that development, please?
Oh, you mean this endorsement from this childless cat lady, right?
I believe that is how she signed off, indeed.
That's how she signed her, with a reference to J.D. Vance's, the vice presidential candidate's, criticism of childless cat ladies. Look, it was very interesting timing. It was kind of like she'd already done a great job on the debate, and then this came out. I actually wondered whether you needed to pile on like this at that moment. Maybe they should have waited to release this endorsement. But it was what everybody was talking about after the debate. There's no doubt about it. My 10-year-old grandson was excited about it. I do think that while it may motivate some young people, frankly, if I were advising Taylor Swift and I said, if you really want to help Biden, try to figure out some way to get young people to register to vote. You got to make sure they're registered to vote. And I don't know, host some concerts in the United States where to come to the concert, you have to register to vote, or, something like that, where it's more tangible than just a tweet, which I don't want to discount the power of the tweet, because I think the Taylor Swift phenomenon is, obvious. But, at the end of the day, getting someone elected is about, it's about the nitty gritty details of this. And hopefully she might, if you're at least a Harris supporter, hopefully she might do something that's even more practical in trying to get people to motivated and get them registered and get them to vote.
That's interesting. And from what you said earlier, I mean, young people, it's the same here in the UK. They just don't vote in the same numbers that older folks do. So perhaps Yeah, it's unsurprising here that politicians tend to respond more to those who vote than those who do not. But interestingly, I do think she did mention in her Instagram story where you could sign up to register.
Yes.
To vote.
Yeah, which is good. Yeah, I look over and above who you vote for. I believe in a democracy. You need to take responsibility as a citizen for the democracy, and that means you need to vote. And even if your guy loses or your woman loses, you did your part. And there's all sorts of political science reasons why young people don't vote as much as older people, et cetera. And frankly, I find that to be an explanation, but not an excuse. So.
My next question, picking up on the childless cat lady sign off that she gave, is I'd like to ask you about the vice presidential picks. Now,
Right.
Donald Trump has chosen J.D. Vance, who I believe is the junior senator from Ohio. Is that correct? Indeed.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Kamala Harris has chosen Tim Walz, who is the governor of, forgive which northern state?
Minnesota.
I mean, to what extent do Americans choose to vote on the basis of the vice presidential pick, and why do the candidates choose them the way they do? I wonder if you could comment on that and whether or not this has had any noticeable effect on voting intention polls.
Sure. I mean, look, John F. Kennedy would not probably have won, except that he chose LBJ from Texas to be his running mate in 1960, and that helped carry Texas and helped get Kennedy elected. I would say for the most part, vice presidents don't help, and sometimes they hurt. Um, uh, Bill Clinton chose Al Gore. They weren't going to win Tennessee anyway. He was a senator from Tennessee, but they wanted to send a message, or two young next generation people about the same age, and where it's a new generation of leadership. So there's some signaling going on. Uh, I think there could be disasters. Sarah Palin was chosen by John McCain, and I think by all accounts, it was a disaster. She was in way over her head. I thought JD Vance was an interesting pick by Trump. I thought it was a doubling down on the MAGA constituency. But since he's from Ohio, I thought, oh, he's going to play well in Pennsylvania. He's going to play well in Michigan. He's going to play well in Wisconsin, these Great Lakes industrial states. And that'll help Trump. It'll kind of reinforce Trump's message. Now, I think JD Vance has shown himself to be, again, in way over his head. And it's not at all clear they vetted him the way you are supposed to vet candidates, go through every single thing they've ever said or written. And because there are just so many things that have come out where he had to be on the defensive. And in fact, the New Yorker has a comedy thing they put out every day, the New Yorker magazine, called Borowitz, which is free. Everybody should subscribe to it. But the headline today was JD Vance saying he's just happy that he wasn't the one to F up. And now I would say that Harris's pick was, I think, what many of the party professionals wanted. They thought he would be good. And I think that he has his performance to date in public has been really super. I mean, really quite good. He's very folksy. But he's a politician, right? He comes off as a traditional politician, but very folksy and very approachable. He was a high school football coach at one point, so everybody calls him coach. I mean, it's like there's a lot of that. What we don't know is that, he had a fairly conservative voting record when he was a member of Congress. And then he became a very liberal governor. Now, was his conservative voting record in Congress simply because he represented a congressional district that was relatively conservative? Maybe, because that was true. It was a conservative district, and that his true roots are in liberalism. Or which guy are you getting here? And we have no idea how this guy's going to play, how he's playing in, the areas where I think people think he can be helpful to her in kind of rural areas, which are overwhelmingly Republican and people what have supported Trump. Um, I think it's actually part of a Harris strategy to say, we may not win, I don't know, North Dakota, not, I mean, North Carolina, but our only chance of winning is not necessarily to run up our just run up our totals among Black and young voters and cities, etc., but to run down Trump's totals in some of the rural areas. Not that we'll win rural areas, but we siphon off a few of those votes. So I think that's the strategy. The other um, possible candidate for her was Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. And I personally thought it would be him just because Pennsylvania is so important. And you got to win Pennsylvania or you can't win the White House. They decided they didn't want that or need that in that way. The outcome of the election will determine whether that was a good choice or not.
Thanks, Bruce. We've got 5 more minutes, probably time for one more question, and then I might just ask you to give your final thoughts on where we might be headed over the rest of the campaign into November. Ian Collins asks, how important, if at all, are the 5.5 million US voters who live abroad, and do they make any difference to the election?
They they make a difference depending on where they live in the United States because their votes are counted in their home state. I've never seen a breakdown as to how they're dispersed over the country. My guess is they are, roughly concentrated in a few states simply because people, Wyoming, probably don't live overseas that often. But I've never seen any analysis that suggested they could swing a state. Now, there is also the kind of, and that I don't know if it's included in that number, the military people who live overseas. And again, their votes are counted in their home state. And that has been something that some people think has had some influence, at least on the congressional level, the Senate level, and swinging districts, because they tend to be more concentrated in certain states because we have a professional military and it's increasingly handed down from like father to son or daughter. It's like runs in the family, and they tends to be more rural areas, more in the South. So that's another issue. Um, uh, it does count in the overall, national vote count, but that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I think it's safe to say the Democrats will win more popular votes than the Republicans. That's been the case again and again and again. But it doesn't matter necessarily. It depends where those votes are concentrated.
Indeed. Now, Bruce, there is a famous saying that predictions are incredibly hard to make, especially about the future. Now, where do you think we are headed over the next few weeks? You said here that there are 5 or 6 key swing states. It's very much on a knife edge, but you've also said that polling often gets it wrong. And I wonder whether or not you might be able to share your views on that and where you think the key battleground will be issues as well as geographically over the next days up until November.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, we know from polling history that maybe you put aside the 2008 financial crisis, which happened very late in the election cycle. For the most part, things that happen in October don't necessarily affect the outcome of, if the economy turns down in October, it doesn't been integrated into people's views to kind of shift their vote. But it does remind us that there are things that happen out there that may be beyond anybody's control that could affect the mood inside the country. Certainly 9/11 was one of those things. There wasn't an election that year, but it impacted the next election. If if a war would break out in the Middle East, a general war, uh, um, you would have Donald Trump saying, "This never would have happened if I were." I mean, he said Russia would have never invaded Ukraine. The Gaza war would have never happened. It's because I would have told him to stop. So, I mean, people may say, "Well, the Democrats aren't handling. We need a Republican." Uh, there, there could be um, some scandal that comes out that affects things. Although, remember, I mean, if it happens with Donald Trump, I don't think it matters. I mean,
Mm,
remember his Access Hollywood tape, and I thought at that point, no woman is ever going to vote for this guy, and he got 47% of the female vote. I mean, so go figure. So I think that it's unlikely that there'll be something that happens, but there could be something. Um, I think the um, uh, the Fed will probably lower interest rates. I think it's next week, but probably only by a quarter percentage point. That's what people think. That's probably not enough to affect people's optimism about the economy, and it's too late in the cycle. Um, so the economy will still be a major issue. The memories of inflation, which is coming down, but still people, you know, everybody wants prices to be what they were 10 or 5 or whatever years ago. And they kind of don't want to accept that prices are basically inflexible downward. They go up over time. They may bounce around, but they tend to go up over time. And what is surprising is that the employment situation has not really benefited the Democrats. We have very low unemployment in the United States. Um, and a lot of the historic Biden accomplishments in the infrastructure bill, or the much reviled Inflation Reduction Act, much reviled by foreigners. Um, much of that hasn't really impacted people yet, so it's not going to help Harris that much at all. I mean, I think if I had to bet my own money today, I would say I think she can win. I wouldn't go so far as to say she will win, but I got to the point where I didn't think Biden could win. And what's interesting is that for the last 6 weeks, she has run an almost perfect campaign. I've been to 9 conventions. That was the most well scripted, well orchestrated, peaceful convention I've ever seen. Again, she kind of hit it out of the ballpark last night. I do think the issue to watch is she's going to stumble at some point. She's going to make some grave mistake. That's what politicians do in election under the pressure of election campaigns. And the question is, does she have the wherewithal, the kind of ability to bounce back, to say, okay, I'll pick myself up and I'm going to go on, and people say, okay, she's fine? Or is she going to start and stumble and stagger and give Trump an opportunity to say, I can govern better than she does?
Yeah, well, certainly we'll be paying close attention here in the UK. As you say, we don't get to vote, but we certainly will be affected by the outcome. Bruce, thank you. That was tremendously interesting. And I think if I may just depart with one observation more into the longer term, I do think the data you shared with us does of course paint a slightly worrying picture about the long-term health, I would say, of the American Republic, noting, as you say, 25% of Democratic voters are supportive of a president who would be unencumbered by the law in wielding power. And substantial numbers of people saying major changes or radical changes are needed in the country. And I think this always makes me think of Stein's law, the famous Stein's law, which of course is if something cannot continue forever, it will stop. And I wonder, in 30 years' time, looking back on this election, what people think about it. But on that note, Bruce, please let me thank you on behalf of everybody joining us tonight online. It was a fantastic discussion. You are such a good friend of the network, so let me please thank you once again for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. And
thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Not at all. And for those joining us, please keep an eye on your inboxes as we will be sharing more information about future ideas network seminars on future topics. Once again, thanks for joining us, Bruce. Thank you, and wishing everyone a good evening.
Bye-bye.